Will President Trump's executive order actually save college sports? We're talking about it here today on Overtime with Matt Moscona. Hello, I'm Matt Moscona, the host of After Further Review on ESPN Radio in Baton Rouge and throughout the state of Louisiana. Also the host of Locked On LSU and the publisher at LouisianaSports.net. Here on Overtime, goal is to talk all things college football. If it's interesting to you, we're talking about it right here. Well, this week, President Trump issued an executive order titled Saving College Sports, whereby he had several directives, among them eliminating third-party pay-for-play NIL deals vis-a-vis collectives, also trying to save non-revenue sports and maintaining certain scholarship distributions so that non-revenue sports and women's sports wouldn't be eliminated altogether. He also urges the NCAA to identify work status of college athletes. I know whenever we see this, it's a bit jarring, but I want to dive into why it maybe isn't as significant as you might think. First of all, before I go any further, I just want to be very clear. This is not a red or a blue conversation. This is not an R or a D conversation. This isn't a MAGA or non-MAGA conversation. Quite honestly, I don't care. If you want those conversations, you get them elsewhere. This is not the place for that. This is strictly talking about this executive order and how it may impact the teams that you and I both love. And honestly, I'm having trouble finding where this executive order has teeth, because effectively what it did is reinforce the House settlement, which was agreed upon and went into effect on July the 1st. Let's start with what is probably the most significant piece of this, which is eliminating third-party pay-for-play deals. That's the one that I think most everyone is going to associate with. Is that as it's said, written here in the piece, waves of recent litigation against collegiate athletics governing rules have eliminated limits on athlete compensation, pay-for-play recruiting inducements, and transfers between universities, unleashing a sea change that threatens the viability of college sports. That's in the executive order. And so the issue here is the House settlement already eliminated, in theory, pay for play. Remember, we explained in a previous video, I'd encourage you to go check that out if you missed it, the difference between NIL and revenue share. So the House settlement eliminated pay for play NIL. It still makes valid, legitimate NIL deals available. So as to say, if a student athlete could do a brand deal, a brand approaches student athlete or vice versa, and then any deal over $600 goes to a clearinghouse, Deloitte, to determine the validity of that deal. By the way, Ross Dellinger at Yahoo has done a great job tracking some of those that have already come through Deloitte, and the percentages that have been approved and not approved, or have gone to an appeals process. So in some respect, it would appear that part is working. But remember, the pay for play component of a collective giving a student athlete money in the transfer portal or to stay at their school, that's no longer allowed under the House settlement. Now, there is a very fair question. So as to say, is that sustainable? Meaning, if there are, hypothetically, you're talking about like 85 student athletes at each school, if every single one has some type of deal with the collective over 130 schools, I mean, you're talking about thousands of NIL deals. Can Deloitte keep up with the management? That's a very fair question. Is it enforceable? But you can say the same thing about this executive order, which we'll come back to in a second. But remember, the House settlement allows for true NIL. So if the starting first baseman on a college baseball team wants to do a deal with a local sports bar where they make appearances and get paid a few $1,000, like, that's totally doable. What's not allowable any longer is the starting quarterback being paid $6 million by the collective, because there's nothing of legitimate value that they could do to earn that money at that level. So the thing, though, that I believe we're going to see, and we're already seeing, is high school NIL. And this is sort of the next frontier. Remember, it is not allowable for these third-party collectives to do those types of pay-for-play deals with current student athletes. However, effectively, all states have enacted some type of legislation on the state level allowing NIL deals with high school athletes. So what's to say now that a collective doesn't, instead of going to their current college student athlete in the transfer portal, redirect those funds to high school NIL? If there's a five-star we recently saw this, a five-star offensive lineman getting a seven-figure deal to go to Texas Tech. Well, that's a third-party collective doing a deal, an NIL deal with a high school student to get them to their campus. Now, there's risk in that because there's nothing binding in these deals. I suppose there could be verbiage in contracts, but the question everyone's going to have is, okay, well, if you do a high school NIL deal with a student athlete, what if they take the money and then sign somewhere else? Maybe there are provisions that would have to repay that money. We'd have to look at those contracts individually and see. Or maybe there are stipulations whereby you have to be on campus to be able to get that money, and it's paid out monthly over the time that you're enrolled in the university, something along those lines to provide some form of protection. But what if you do a giant NIL deal in high school with a student athlete to get them signed with their school, and a year later they're gone? Well, that's certainly a very fair question to ask, and something we'll see over time how it evolves. But I think that would be on the collectives to make sure that they're structuring these high school NIL deals such that they do have those protections where you're not giving a student athlete $6 million up front or whatever it is. They would only achieve that money if they stayed on campus for 3-4 years with monthly installments, something along those lines. All that to say, as it relates to the executive order only reinforced the House settlement. It doesn't do anything to address this. And then the other real legitimate part of this that you have to ask is, does the executive branch really, number one, does the executive branch have the authority to go enforce something like this or enact something like this? And number two, can they actually enforce it? Like, is the executive branch going to provide the resources to enforce this executive order? Like, do you really want the executive branch providing resources whereby they're monitoring this type of behavior across the landscape of college football? Or is it meant to be more of just a little bit of saber rattling? Only time will tell how that can play out. The other interesting component, aside from just the third-party collective piece, was the financial investment into the non-revenue sports and the scholarships as well. Well, keep in mind, Title IX is still federal law, and that matters because almost all of the schools, the athletic programs that you and I cheer for, almost all of them are state schools. They're public institutions. There are exceptions. I mean, there's Notre Dame and there's Vanderbilt and there's the University of Miami and the University of Southern California. And there's private schools that compete at a high level, Northwestern and the Big Ten. So there are private schools that compete at the highest level, but overwhelmingly we're talking about your LSUs and your Florida States and your Ohio States and so on. And all of those schools rely in some capacity on federal funding. So they are beholden to the U.S. Department of Education. Now, President Trump has also discussed trying to disband the Department of Education. So that's something that could, in time, maybe affect Title IX. But as of now, Title IX is still federal law. And it says that you have to spend the same amount of money on female sports as you do on men's sports. Now, the revenue share component of this in the House settlement does not apply to Title IX, or Title IX does not apply to revenue share. So to say it another way, every school, every athletic department can now share up to $20.5 million of its revenue with its student athletes. There was a big question, would that have to be split evenly among men's and women's sports? The answer clearly is no, as per the House settlement, and there's been no challenge to that as of yet. So, for example, we recently had a report from Wilson Alexander, the advocate in Baton Rouge, that LSU is spending 75% on football, 15% on men's basketball, 5% on women's basketball, and the final 5% on every other sport combined. That's revenue share. But that doesn't account for what you spend with the rest of your revenue. Scholarships for men's and women's sports, travel budgets, all the other stuff. Like that is still under the jurisdiction of Title IX. And so the executive order would reinforce that, but you can't start cutting those non-revenue sports or scholarships because you would be in violation of Title IX. Then you could thereby have an investigation by the Department of Education. And if you were found in violation, they could certainly cut federal funding to your university, which not only at an athletic department level they don't want, but the people that run the university, the chancellors, the presidents, the board of trustees, those people need federal funding to operate the university. So naturally, they're going to make sure they stay in compliance with Title IX and that federal law. So all this to say, the most important components of the president's executive order are either already addressed under current federal law or were addressed in the House settlement, which went into effect on July the 1st. I think the real interesting thing that we're going to have to continue to watch is the evolution of the enforcement of NIL. It's my single biggest overarching question. Can Deloitte, this third-party clearinghouse, can Deloitte keep up with the enforcement of overseeing every NIL deal over $600? I mean, that's what they're charged with here. I mean, I'm a partner in Parish Construction and Roofing in Louisiana. If we wanted to do a $1,000 deal with a student athlete to appear in a social media post for us, that deal would have to go to Deloitte for approval to say, yes, this student athlete carries that amount of requisite value and the deliverable is you can move forward with this deal. They would have to do this thousands upon thousands of times for every single NIL deal that every student athlete does. That just feels so daunting a task. It's hard to imagine Deloitte keeping up with that. And if they can't, do we just go back to the way things were with brown paper bags filled with cash under the table? That's the thing that I will be most interested in seeing as this all moves forward. And we'll go back to it again. Does the executive branch want to try to enact, engage in enacting and enforcing this executive order and the House settlement? It is a brave new world of college football and all of college athletics. But for everyone who's wondering what the executive order from the president means, as of right now, not a whole lot, but it could change as we continue to see this evolve. So stay tuned. I do personally believe that we will get to a point where we see athletic departments cutting sports. Because they're going to have to, in order to compete at the highest level, you're going to have to participate in revenue share at the highest level. You cannot allow, if you're a major college athletic department trying to compete for championships, you cannot allow the other major athletic departments to outspend you. So if Alabama and Ohio State and Michigan and Southern Cal and Oregon are all spending $20.5 million, then Florida can't spend 15. You've got to spend the max amount. So with that being the case, as athletic departments try to find ways to fund revenue share, they've got to either make more or spend less. Well, part of spending less, I think, isn't the eventuality of cutting the non-revenue sports, cutting spending in non-revenue sports, and ultimately, I think, cutting non-revenue sports. I do believe we are headed for that day where that will happen. But I don't think that day is here just yet. As this evolves, we'll certainly keep you up to date with us. Hey, thanks for making it here through the end of the video. Do me a favor, if you would, please subscribe to the channel, smash that like button, and drop your comments below. We appreciate it greatly. It is overtime here with Matt Moscona. If you have something you'd like me to discuss on the channel, I'd be happy to do it. Drop me a note. I'm on Twitter at Matt Moscona, X at Matt Moscona, or any platform. As I always say, you can spell my name, you can find me online. We'll see.